The wind carried the stench of rot as soldiers marched into the scorched village. Fires had devoured half the wooden homes. Screams had long ceased. Anwen crouched beside a corpse, her mother's shawl clutched to her face. The grain stores were empty. Even the rats had disappeared days ago. When the boots came, she didn't run. There was nowhere left to go. She was dragged alongside other survivors, mostly women, and a few trembling boys shoved into carts like broken furniture. The guards didn't speak her language, but their threats were universal. Along the frostbit road, one girl leaped from the cart. Anwen watched her skull crack on the stones. No one reacted. Death had become ordinary at the fortress. The prisoners were separated. The healthy were marked for labor, the sick left in the mud. Anwen was led into a chamber filled with incense. Her rags were torn away. A physician examined her face, turning it left, then right, without explanation. He called for someone. That man, dressed in black velvet, stared at her as if beholding a ghost. "She's the mirror," he muttered, and ordered her washed. She was bathed in freezing water, her hair hacked into shape, cheeks powdered white. They called her Lady J, though she understood nothing. Her wrists were bound in silk as they dressed her in a silver gown. It stank of mothballs and wine. Perfume was dabbed beneath her ears, not to honor her, but to conceal the truth of what she'd lived through. In a candlelit corridor, she was made to wait. The walls whispered around her, "He's waiting. Don't speak, Beau." Her heartbeat pulsed in her throat. Then, the door opened. Inside sat the king. She didn't know his name, but his presence was unmistakable. Bloated, skin gray, breath ragged. Ulcers on his legs leaked through stained bandages. Still, he stared at her with reverence. "Jane," he whispered. She remained still. A servant nudged her forward. The king raised a shaking hand and gestured for her to sit beside him. She obeyed, her hands trembling in her lap. He did not touch her. He only gazed, eyes wet with memory. "I prayed you'd return," he murmured. "And now, heaven delivers." A monk stepped forward, declaring it a divine sign. The queen had returned to guide the king to peace. Anwen understood only fragments. Words like angel, grace, mercy. None belonged to her. They belonged to the dead woman whose face she apparently wore. That night, Anwen sat alone in a bed too large, beneath a canopy embroidered with lions. The doors were locked from outside. Candles flickered low. The silk itched her skin. She stared at the mirrored cabinet across the room. A face she barely recognized stared back. Pale, noble, hollow. Her own, yet not. She began to understand. Her name was gone. Her voice didn't matter. She was to be a ghost, animated only for the whims of a dying man. Her hunger didn't matter. Her sorrow meant nothing. They had given her a new life, not as a person, but as a replacement. A memory clung to her mind, her mother brushing snow from her shoulders in the old cottage. That warmth now seemed imaginary. Here, only echoes surrounded her. She lay down, afraid to sleep, afraid to wake, afraid to exist as anything other than what they demanded. And far down the corridor, the king smiled in his drugged haze, believing, for a moment, that death had lost its power. The air inside the palace was damp with mold and smoke. Each morning, Anwen was woken by a bell, dressed by silent hands, and led to the East Gallery. There, she was made to sit in stillness beneath faded tapestries, where light barely reached. Her gown was changed daily, always in shades. Jane Seymour once wore gray, ivory, soft blue. She was forbidden to speak unless spoken to. Even her sighs were watched. Her food arrived cold, a thin broth, a hard crust of bread, and occasionally a bruised apple. The servants who brought it never met her eyes. When she once asked for more, the dish was removed in silence. Her requests were not hers to make. Even hunger had to be obedient. She was not alone in her captivity. Down a dim hallway, lived a blind boy who played lute every morning for the king's prayers. They said he resembled one of Henry's lost sons. He never spoke. A girl with burned scars dressed on Juan's hair each evening, her fingers stiffed from frostbite, her eyes empty. None of them knew each other's names, only the roles they had been forced to wear. They moved like shadows through the hallways of memory that didn't belong to them. The king rarely called for her, but when he did, she was to appear instantly. He would stare, sometimes smile, sometimes cry. Once, he gripped her wrist so tightly. She bled through the sleeve. She wasn't permitted to flinch. The physician applied ointment and told her gently, "Don't remind him of pain." Her days blurred. Needlework she wasn't allowed to finish, prayers in a language she didn't speak. Long hours staring at garden hedges shaped like dead queens. Her letters, home if they were even sent, went unanswered. Perhaps there was no one left to receive them. Perhaps her village no longer existed. She began to lose her grip on time. The palace bells tolled, not for worship but for power. Priests delivered sermons about duty and divine punishment. She was reminded constantly. She had been chosen. She was not a prisoner. She was a gift. The punishment was in the honor. The women in the palace feared touching her. Some bowed. Some whispered behind her back. They called her his memory bride. A guard once asked if she believed in ghosts. She said nothing. He laughed and said, "You are one." Each week, she was required to stand at a window for 1 full hour at dusk, so the king might glimpse her if he wished. She was not told if he watched. She stood still, hands folded, as candles melted down her arms. Her body began to betray her. Bruises that didn't heal, hair that fell in clumps, a cough that returned each night, but she was ordered to smile when needed, to hum old lullabies as if they were hers. One of the priests told her that, if she ever said she was unhappy, she would be sent to the nuns, where silence is eternal. She once tried to speak to the blind boy, whispered her name, her real name. He flinched and turned away. No one was allowed to remember who they were. At night, dreams came of her mother's voice, but always distorted. Sometimes she screamed awake, only to be punished with isolation. The walls of her chamber grew closer each day. The mirrors were covered. She was not allowed to look at herself anymore. One evening, she overheard a lady-in-waiting whisper that the king's ulcers had turned black, that he'd begun hallucinating, that he screamed Jane's name through the halls. The palace was dying, slowly, from the head down. Anwen pressed her hand against the cold stone wall. She whispered her name, once more, just to remember how it felt. But the silence swallowed it. The coughing grew louder from the royal wing. Servants moved like ghosts, eyes down, mouths shut. Word spread in hushed fragments. Henry hadn't walked in days. His breath stank of rot. The pus from his wounds stained every sheet. No one spoke. It allowed, but death hovered close. Anwen felt the change before anyone told her. The guards no longer stood straight when she passed. Her food arrived later. The perfumes stopped coming. They didn't need her as much now. She was kept in her chamber for days. No more embroidery. No window hours. The girl who brushed her hair never returned. The silence wasn't just in the room, it wrapped around her ribs. Even the blind boys. Music had stopped. One morning, the only visitor she had was a rat, bold enough to nibble her untouched bread. When the physician finally came, he didn't check her pulse. He just looked at her face and shook his head. "The resemblance fades," he said, more to himself than to her. "And the king is almost gone." She opened her mouth to speak, but he'd already walked away. The next day, she was ordered too fast. The monks claimed she must prepare for penance. She asked why. No one answered. Her name had been gone long before, but now even her purpose was vanishing. They said nothing, but she saw it in their eyes. She was no longer necessary. She was summoned to the chapel, not dressed in silks, but in a plain wool shift. Her hair was cut without warning. The sharp scrape of shears felt like punishment. In the candlelit darkness, a priest placed a coarse veil on her head and whispered, "You are here to atone for being what you are not." She knelt on the cold stone floor for hours. The priest read scripture in Latin. She didn't understand a word. Her knees bled. Still, she was forbidden to move. A nobleman passed through once and looked at her like one glances at an old portrait, familiar, meaningless. She recognized his face. He had once poured her wine. Back in her chamber, she found her mirror gone. Her gowns replaced with coarse robes. Her jewelry vanished. The message was clear. The illusion was no longer needed. She wasn't a ghost anymore. She was nothing. That night, thunder cracked over the palace. Using the chaos, she slipped from her bed, barefoot, and made her way to the servant halls. She needed only bread, or a way out, or a face that would acknowledge hers. In the corridor, she ran into a guard. Not the kind one. This one had laughed when she cried. He didn't speak, just raised his hand and struck her hard enough to knock her down. She awoke in the dark, stone walls, damp air, chains, the oubliette, the place where they kept secrets. She screamed. No answer. Time stopped existing. She counted rats instead of hours. A priest visited only once, brought no food, only a candle. "The king is dying," he said. "Soon you will be forgotten. Accept it. You were a vessel. Nothing more." She didn't reply. She just stared at the flame and wondered what burning felt like. When the candle went out, something inside her cracked. She began to mutter her name again and again, voice raspy, mouth dry. It felt foreign, but she refused to let it go. Each whisper was a resistance, no matter how small. She wasn't told when the king died. She only knew because the bells rang for hours without stopping. Muffled footsteps passed above her. She heard no cheers, no cries, just a silence thick with fear. She pressed her fingers into the dirt, wondering what would happen next. But she no longer hoped. She didn't know that her image, once praised as sacred, would now be called dangerous. She didn't know that the new regime had already decided her fate. She only knew that the world was shifting and she would not survive it the way they'd made her. The bells stopped. Days later, the lock turned. Two men entered without speaking. They lifted her by the arms, ignoring her weightless protest, and dragged her through narrow stone corridors. The palace above had changed. No more perfume, no banners, tapestries stripped, courtiers gone. What remained smelled of vinegar and dust. The king was dead. Power had shifted. She was not led to an executioner, nor the river. Instead, she was thrown into a cart with a covered cage, and three other women silent, nameless, wrapped in gray. A nun sat beside them, lips pressed tight, rosary clenched. They rode in silence for 2 days. The countryside blurred past. Number one looked at her face anymore. Her image, once divine, had become a stain they wanted buried. They arrived at the Abbey of St. Juan, a cold monastic fortress on the edge of the Thames. The gates swallowed them whole. Inside, the world was ash and echo. The nuns did not ask questions. The abbess read from a parchment, then said flatly, "She shall be Sister Mary of the Vision." No one asked if she agreed. That was her new name, and it was final. She was placed in a bare cell, with a straw mat, a wooden crucifix, and a bowl for water. Her days began with prayer and ended with silence. They gave her a black habit and taught her chants in Latin. Her Welsh tongue was forbidden. Her old name was never mentioned again. When she once whispered it, under her breath, she was slapped. Labor filled every hour, scrubbing stone floors, crushing herbs, tending to the dead. When the plague came, the abbey locked its doors. The nuns treated the infected with vinegar and cloth. Some died in the halls. No one wept. She tended bodies in silence, her own breath shallow, her fingers blistered. She never complained. Years passed. Her face grew thin, lines forming where youth once clung. Her reflection, when glimpsed in water, no longer matched the woman Henry once worshipped. That version of her had died in the palace, suffocated beneath silks and lies. Now she was bone and breath and obedience. She was never called to speak again of the king. The outside world shifted, monarchs rose, wars raged, but inside the routine never changed. The abbess once said, "We are the wall between sin and memory." One believed her. One winter morning, an unfamiliar visitor arrived, a court historian, seeking records of Henry's last days. He walked the abbey halls, asking strange questions. When he saw her in the garden, kneeling by the frozen herbs, he paused. "She looks like Jane Seymour," he muttered, then shrugged and moved on. She didn't react. She just pressed her hands deeper into the soil. No one told the historian that she had once been Lady J. No one said she had slept beneath royal velvet or been paraded like a holy relic. The records held no mention. Her role had been erased the moment the king stopped breathing. At night, she sometimes dreamed of a voice calling her real name, but she never answered. She was no longer that girl. Not the captive, not the ghost. Just one more silent figure. In the garden, planting herbs that would outlive her. When she finally died, decades later, her burial was quiet. No procession, no monument, just a shallow grave beneath the abbey oak tree, marked with a wooden cross. The sisters called her faithful. Nothing more. The world forgot her, but she had already forgotten herself.